everyone, I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and today we're going to dye some yarn in shoe boxes. And one of our dye pots that I plan to use actually has some of the dyes I am planning to use in it. I am coming near the end of a lot of my different dye stocks. These are all acid dye stock solutions where they started at a 1% strength with 1 gram of dye per 100 milliliters of liquid. And I would say I probably have less than 100 milliliters of these colors combined. I do have some other colors that maybe I'll bring in, but we'll see where we get with these and then keep playing with the color. I really want to dye by feel, using up the dye stocks and creating a gorgeous colorway that would probably be hard to reproduce at some point because I'm not measuring anything. Now, these 4 colors are Electric Violet, Intense Iris, Caribbean Blue, and Dark Navy. The one big note with the Intense Iris is that I used it for a shoebox technique, the same batch, and the color looked less pigmented before the yarn had time to cold process and absorb some of that color. Cold process shoebox, what on earth am I talking about? Because you need to add heat with acid dyes in some capacity for the dyes to bind to yarn. And I don't want to apply any heat to this plastic shoe boxes. These are literal shoebox plastic boxes. They cannot have any heat. I'm sure they'd be fine with hot tap water, but boiling water would probably melt or at least severely warp them. So we're not applying heat directly to the shoe boxes. What we are going to do is something called cold process, where I'm going to set up the yarn, the dye, and eventually the acid while everything is at room temperature. Let it sit overnight, usually 1 to 2 days at room temperature, and then we'll go ahead and steam set our colors to finish heat setting everything. Now, with the yarn bases I will be using today and a bunch of these pigments, typically that works really well. There are some pigments that require a little bit more time, especially at a low temperature. I keep my house at like 65 in the winter, and so it can take longer to do that. But this is something that is handy to do when my stove is busy with other projects, or really because I want to. I pre-soaked our yarn today in some plain tap water for a couple of hours. I picked some really pigmented blue zip ties because my goal was to create something blue or blurple. As we add the colors, it may end up being on the more purple side of blue, but you know what? It's all good. It all depends on the proportions of the colors that we add. And also, I'm going really free flowing, so we may blend everything together. We may not. I may add the colors and leave things more unblended and variegated as we go. I have 2 yarn pieces that I've pre-soaked. 200 grams of Knit Pick Stroll fingering weight yarn, which is 75% superwash merino wool, 25% nylon, and 200 grams of Knit Picks Switch DK, which is 100% superwash merino wool. Each batch of yarn will have its own shoebox, but I intend to dye them, at least for now, a similar colorway, but who knows, maybe we'll do some things a little differently. I'm making this one up as I go along. We're free flowing today. If you would like to learn more about any of the tools or equipment I use in my videos, I have links and affiliate links down in the video description, and I may earn a commission if you make a purchase through one of my links. One of the first things I want to do, because especially with the Caribbean Blue, we have so little dye left in here, is I want to take the colors and partition them a little bit. I'm not rinsing out the bottles because I plan to do that with another project. Okay, we have a lot more of the Intense Iris. Still, I don't think quite 100 milliliters. We don't have a lot of Electric Violet. This is one of my favorite colors. It is also one of the most expensive colors on Dharma Trading Company's website. I think one of the pigments in here is quite expensive. Okay, and then the Dark Navy. All right, I'm not using all of it. I'm going a little bit similar to these other colors. And we'll just see where we are. Okay, but part of the reason for doing this partitioning is so I could add some water to these colors, which I'm totally gonna forget who is who. Maybe not. The thing with the intense iris is that it almost looks like there is mica or something in there. I know that there's not, obviously, but it's just because that color is not that soluble. We've got 2 shoe boxes. One of them already has 8 cups of water. I'm gonna add 8 cups of water to the other. And I did not rinse this from where the dye containers were, and we're looking fine. Now, there is no acid in either of these containers yet. We will be doing that later on. Now, in one of our shoe boxes, I'm gonna add 200 grams of our Swish DK, adding this in, and you can see that 8 cups of water is an amount that allows the yarn to really fill the container. Sometimes pigmented zip ties can cause a little bit of backstaining on the yarn. This is not something I'm very concerned about today, mainly because we're adding a lot of blues into our yarn anyway, and at this point, the zip ties have been on the yarn for a short period of time. This is something I will frequently see more after an extended pre-soak. And Rebecca, doing a cold process dye, isn't that an extended pre-soak? Yes, yes it is. But again, we're adding a bunch of blues, so it shouldn't be a huge, huge deal. Now I have a technique I like to call the shoebox technique, where I will pour the dyes on, sometimes let it sit, sometimes not, add acid, lift the yarn, and add it back in to blend things. I don't know if that's what we're gonna do today. I'm sort of going to keep things a little loosey-goosey and see where we end up, but I'm gonna start bringing in this Caribbean blue and trying to be somewhat even about both colors. But right now, that color is very much on the surface. Ooh, you know what would be fun as I work this through? This is not something I usually do with my quote shoebox technique. It would be really, really fun to do this and do, because it's so, the yarn is so compressed in here, it would be fun to do this where I add the yarn, I add the dye to one side, and then flip the yarn and add the dye to the other, and do that with acid in a shoebox. Ooh, I gotta do that. Okay. That was our, gosh, okay, that was our Caribbean blue. What do I want to do? All right, let's do, this is not the direction I thought I was going to go. Let's do our electric violet just a bit for now. And we're going to work this through. Now again, there's no acid in here yet, which in theory means that we should be able to get more color coverage throughout our yarn. It just depends on how much I move things to help that color work through. I don't have a yarn mop today, so we are just using these containers. Now I can look and I can see along the bottom that I have not worked the colors through everywhere yet. This is why I often will lift the yarn and move everything through, which we might do eventually here. Okay, let's do our intense iris. Which again is a color that I found made more of an impact later on than it does right now. We are making the Caribbean blue a little bit less bright already. I'm my hands are so wet and my paper towels are so dry. Or so dry, so damp now. Okay, and then I do still have more color. So I think what I'm gonna do is just like towards the edge, bring in that dark navy. And I'm working it through, but not putting it very far down. I do think what I want to do is let things sit. Let me go clean up a little bit. All right, I'm walking around. I will show you, I see some patches of white down on the sides, which I could work through. But if there's patches of white on either side, that means that there are patches of white on the bottom as well. Here we have the side of the stroll, and here we have the side of the Swish DK. My tap water is slightly acidic, so some pigments will start striking to yarn before I've had a chance to work it through. In fact, I had a silky lasagna that I did recently, sending everything up with no acid. And when you add the next layer of yarn on, you can see how pastel it is compared to the previous layer. While there was still a lot of color left in there, it's not moving all the way through the yarn all the time. But I am really, really excited about the idea of a color on each side doing this in the shoebox without maybe working it through. And who knows, maybe I'll be setting that up later today. I'm like super excited and inspired about that. I just came in to say, did I set a timer? There were 8 seconds left, and so that was kind of exciting. Okay, I do see color in the water, but what I'm gonna do now is we're gonna do 1, 2, 3 tablespoons of white vinegar. I'm gonna lift up the yarn, flip it over. We're not waiting very long before we add it back in. And yes, this did blend things some, but it's helping us just check the coverage of what we have already, and we can add a little bit more color, work it through, and then not move it. So we're gonna do the same thing, aiming for similar types of spots. 3 tablespoons of white vinegar, lifting the yarn, rotating it, and lowering it back down. Again, knowing that this is gonna give us some amount of color blend, but also it's just helping us get a little more coverage. And so what maybe you couldn't see was that as I lifted the yarn up, and what's amazing, there's not that much color down there right now. As I lifted the yarn up, what we could see was some white, which we have some pastel color on there now. But what we could also see was that the dye that was left in, there was the darker color here and brighter color down there, still remaining. Now this time, when I come to add some color, things are gonna strike faster because we have some acid in here already. So as I pour the color on, I'm gonna wanna work it through a little bit faster, just because I know it's gonna strike a little quicker. And we can add a little bit more, and again, just working it through. I don't want it to be too intense in any spot. And don't worry about the little leftovers in the cups. I got plans for that in another project. Now I don't have any more of the Caribbean blue. I do have more iris, which I am bringing in and working that through. That may overtake a lot of the Caribbean blue or not. There are pigments, and hyacinth is one, where they almost seem to disappear when you first add them and then they reappear later. I don't know if the intense iris is one of those. So I don't know if we're gonna see sort of a change in intensity or not. Okay, and now for the navy, I'm adding it mostly down at the end. So navy is a little bit, oh, and there's some globs in there of dye. I may leave that behind because I don't really want to end up with any speckles. But dark navy is a temperature sensitive color. We're gonna just see how everything works. Now, the reason why that this works and all, because you'll see how little color there is there. So much of the color can bind to the yarn while it is still cold. But you still want to have that heat just because you want to make sure that your colors are well set. But this is where we are at time 0, I suppose. And so at this point, there's really not much left to do besides cover them, which I do mainly because then I can do, there's a handy feature that allows me to stack the boxes. And I'm gonna set these aside for a couple of days, maybe just until tomorrow, but 1 or 2 days. And we'll come back to look at the yarn and see what we see. These plastic shoe boxes, I think, were each under like $2 or $3 each. I love them. But I do have to have the yarn pretty scrunched up in order to fit it in there. And so someday, maybe I'll get some plastic containers that are bigger so that way I don't have to scrunch the yarn, but it gives me a way to set things up and then set it aside until I'm ready to steam set things in a lot of batches. Because with this technique, I could set up 12 shoe boxes today. I mean, I'm only doing the 2, but I could have set up 12 in a relatively short span of time and then spent a different day steam setting everything. Now, one other note, we have observed recently that our dark navy dye does shift when it goes and is exposed to steam. I don't think that's something that we're gonna really observe a lot of here today. We may a little bit, but without controls, who's to say? I just think that our colors are pretty and I hope that we're gonna like the finished result. I think the bigger variable here is that the iris may come out to play more than I'm expecting, like it did when I did this Hanukkah colorway. It is the next day. Oh, this is beautiful. Ooh, okay, I am seeing some pigments left behind. Not a lot, mostly around that iris end. Let's see, that was with the decay. Yes, I'm also seeing a little bit of particles around the intense iris end, but this is gorgeous. All right, I'm arranging everything very carefully into my steamer basket where I'm gonna steam set things for 30 minutes. And now I'm gonna rinse and wash these containers. You may notice 3 lids. I was doing something else around here as well. And so I just wash them out with soap and water and then we're good to go. All right. This is so pretty. I'm hoping that we won't have any bleeding from that intense iris, which, ooh, we're getting intense in some spots. I'm not seeing significant color. Yeah, there's no color bleeding down there. So I think we may have just had a few particles of whatever was left behind. But look at that. Yeah, there's a shadow, but it's very saturated down there. But anyway, I'm gonna set this aside to cool completely so then we can wash it. In the chaos that is my evening, let's wash our yarn. Oh man. All right, I added the foreskeins in and added some clear dish soap. Not that it needs to be clear, but it's just for demonstration purposes, makes the most sense. Now the end I'm most worried about bleeding is the end closest to the zip ties. Because that is the side where there was color left in our shoe boxes. The good news is I'm not seeing any color come out, which is great. I get a little bit more nervous, and I know things are a little tangled right now. It will actually probably resolve itself before we hit the point where the yarn is dry. But just in case, worry about it when it's dry. But what I was going to say is that the time that I am much more concerned about getting a good wash on the yarn is when I've been dealing with dry dye powders to dye the yarn. Because there's a chance that there's a big clump of dye that was sitting on the surface and you just want to rinse it off so it doesn't cause any issues. But anyway, I am more than satisfied with the way this is finishing off. We've got a beautiful color here. Very much more purple. Like, I would probably call this more of a purple colorway than a blue one, but I love it. I need to make more blue yarn for the shop. That's the only thing in my brain. But anyway, I'm gonna go pop this through my spin dryer, hang it up to dry, and we'll see the finished yarn. This yarn turned out so much fun. Now, typically when I do what I call the shoebox method, I add the colors in, and then I lift and blend everything pretty quickly, or basically as soon as I add acid, giving something way more blended overall. Today, I let things sit with acid for a bit before blending it, and then added a little bit more color. This gave us a variegated colorway that is semi-repeating because, you know, we have the section of light blue. You can see a lot of these individual colors that we added, but we still have some coverage and blending and pastels versus if I had painted it with like a squeeze bottle or something on the counter and then just steam set it that way. Now, it could be worth getting a larger shoebox or apparatus to play around with this so then things aren't scrunched up, but I rather like the effect and I really like how this turned out. We do have some little speckles that seem to be a little bit more pronounced on the DK weight yarn, but they are still present on the fingering weight yarn. This comes from using older dye stocks, although if Intense Iris was one of the colors that I used, and I believe that it was, that is a color that doesn't dissolve super well and so could be prone to leaving little specks depending on the technique you're using. And so to avoid that, then you may want to start with something hot versus cold, so that way the dye is more likely to stay in solution. But I like the surprise speckles. Sometimes I pre-soak yarn and have a really firm idea of what I want to do and what I want to create. Other times it's more of, I have this yarn, I have this equipment free today, I have these colors that I want to use, and then let's see where we go. Let's see what the colors are doing on the yarn, and then sort of make things up as we go. And you can end up with something really lovely and magical when you are playing around with dyeing by feel versus measuring things more. Now, I believe I did measure things to an extent to keep the total amount of pigment similar between the two shoe boxes. I'm filming these conclusions a long time after I dyed the yarn, so if I'm wrong, here's editing, Rebecca. But you could do this, and I tend to get a fair amount of consistency with watching the time that I pour. And over time you get a feel for, okay, this is, I'm pouring for this length of time, I'm distributing a similar volume of pigment in both of my containers, which can work well sometimes. Other times then you see more variation overall, but it's just something to, I guess, keep in mind as you're planning. You can go in with like a very firm plan, or you can go in with more of a, I want to create something, let's see how it turns out. And I find that I'm the most likely to be really excited with my yarn when I go into a project with the, I wonder what will happen, or I wonder what we'll get if I do X, Y, or Z, or use colors A, B, C. I am more likely to feel frustration or not always disappointment, but like, oh, that didn't turn out the way I expected, when I have a vision of what I'm hoping to create in my head, and then I don't hit it or nail it with whatever technique and things I was doing. And there are pros and cons to both approaches. But if you're just starting out dyeing yarn, even if you want to measure things and try to make things as reproducible for yourself as possible, approaching a project with, all right, I wonder what I'll end up with if I use a immersion dyeing technique and pour on these 3 different colors and these quantities on this yarn base. How will this turn out? How will this vary from what I've done previously with similar conditions? And then you're more likely to be really excited with how the yarn is in the end. Of course, I do want to acknowledge that since my job is to dye yarn and fill content behind it, and a lot of the yarn that I dye is not for my own personal use, but goes as inventory in my shop, it's really easy for me to take risks and play around with different color combinations and techniques because I'm not always dyeing things with a specific project or end goal in mind. And so I think that if you think, oh my gosh, Rebecca's never disappointed, I'm coming from things from a different point of view because I know that even if a yarn isn't my personal favorite, which don't get me wrong, I like this yarn a lot, someone else may love it and be able to give it a good home and turn it into a scarf or hat or the contrasting color of a sweater, whatever they may want to create. And so anyway, I'm babbling a bit. But if you're still here, make sure you're subscribed. Sometimes YouTube unsubscribes people, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new video. I post at least twice a week, usually on Tuesday and Friday mornings. And then there's bonus videos, sometimes special events where we'll have nightly videos. And well, all of it is so much fun and you don't want to miss anything. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and thank you so much for watching.